What's going on, guys? In this video, we're going to create a QR code generator with vanilla JavaScript. Now, what made me think of this project is the other day I went out to breakfast with my family and at the restaurant, and I've seen this at many restaurants, they have a QR code for you to scan, and then it opens up their menu and you can order. Basically, you can pre-order so that they have it ready for you when you get up there in the line. So I thought, why not create something to allow people to make these QR codes? And I created this QR code generator where we can enter a URL. This might be like I said, like a restaurant menu or something. We can choose the size and we can generate the code. So now if you scan this with your phone, it's going to open up that URL. We can also save it as an image. You can print it out, whatever. So very, very simple. It took me about 4 or 5 hours to create this and deploy it. It's at QRcodes.tech right now. So before we get into building this, I just want to talk a little bit about side projects, because this is a good example of a very simple side project that could bring you some monthly recurring revenue. You know, if you were to do some SEO and then add some Google AdSense on the page, you might be able to make a few bucks per month. I mean, it's definitely not going to be a gold mine. There are a lot of other QR code generators, so it's not like an innovative idea, but it is something that you could put up, you know, even if it's just to put on your portfolio or resume. I would encourage you to do small projects like this. You know, not every project has to be this big endeavor that takes up all your time. So just something to think about. And that's even if your goal is to become a developer at a big tech company, it's nice to have these little side projects. All right, so as far as how we're going to build this, like I said, we're using vanilla JavaScript. If you want to use a framework, you could, but I'm not really going to scale this up, and you know, I'm not going to add any more features to it. So why even use a framework? It's only about 70 lines of code or so. All right, and we're going to use Tailwind for the whole UI, for the design. So we won't be writing any CSS, but we will be using Tailwind classes. So this is a library that I found, QRcode.js, which is very simple. All you have to do is create this QR code object, add the URL that you want to open, add the size, the color, and it generates it, puts it on the page. So initially I was just going to show you how to do that, but I figured it's so easy, I wanted to do something a little more in depth, so I went ahead and created an application where you can put in the URL in a form as well as the size and generate it, and also download it as an image. And then I have the repo right here. I'll have the link to that in the description if you want to grab the images or anything. But yeah, so I figured it'd be a nice little project, so that's it. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, guys, so I have VS Code open, and all I've done is created an index.html, which is completely empty, and then in my JS folder, I have a script.js, which is also completely empty, and then an img folder with my images, and you can get those from the repo. In fact, you don't need the screenshot. I mean, you can keep it if you want, but you don't need it. All right, so to get started here, let's go into our index.html and create an HTML5 boilerplate. And then for the title, we're going to say QR code generator. And then we want to link our script that's in the JS folder. So let's go ahead and say script source. And we want to bring in JS/script.js. And since I put it at the top, I'm going to use defer. All right, and then in the body, just for now, I'll put an H1, save that, and you can just open up the index.html on your file system, or if you're using VS Code, you can use an extension called Live Server, which is what I'm using. So I'm just going to say open with Live Server, and that will open it on port 5500 by default. All right, and I'm just going to leave the finished product here just for reference. As far as the UI, we don't have a style sheet here because we're going to be using Tailwind, and we're just going to use Tailwind classes. So if you go to tailwindcss.com and then get started, there's a few ways to get started. If you want to use the CLI, you can. I'm going to just use the CDN just to keep it simple. So I'm going to grab that script tag right here, and let's put it right above our script tag. And then I do want to use a different font. I'm going to be using the Poppins font. So to do that, without having to, you know, add some CSS and say body and then font family, we can use the config object. So I'm going to grab this script tag that has this Tailwind config object, and we'll put this right under that. And then we're just going to get rid of this colors here, and let's say font family, which is going to be an object, and then this is for the sans font, so we want to say sans, and whoops, that should be in the damn object. So let's say sans, and that's going to be an array with the fonts we want to add. So let's say Poppins and sans dash serif. All right, so we'll save that, and now we should have the Poppins font. All right. So the next thing we need is the QR code library. So this right here, QRcode.js, this allows us to create a QR code object. Now, in the documentation here, whether it's this page or the GitHub, they don't really show you how to add it. So there's no CDN. So what I did is I went to cdnjs.com and searched for QR code, and it came up right here. So I'm just going to, right here it says copy script tag. I'm just going to click on that, and then I'll go ahead and put this right here, and we'll paste that in, and now we should be able to use that library. All right, so that should be it for like the head and anything we have to, any dependencies that we have to include. So now we can start to work on the layout, which isn't going to be too bad. We have just a header here, or a nav bar if you want to call it that. There's no navigation, but you know, just the header, and then this is going to be a flex box, and this will be the first flex item, the text in the form, and this will be the second flex item, which is just the image. And then once we generate a code, we're gonna add the spinner functionality with JavaScript, and then the code will be shown down here with a button to save it as an image. All right, so let's get started with the header. So I'm going to go right into the body here. Let's get rid of that, and let's say header. And actually, trying to think if I should add the classes as we go, because there is quite a bit. Any of you guys that have used Tailwind, you know that there are a lot of classes. So, and this is not a Tailwind course. I have a full 12-hour Udemy course on Tailwind. I'll put the link to that in the description. I also have a crash course and plenty of other Tailwind videos. But I will explain kind of what these do as I go along. So let's say BG Red 500. That's going to be the background color of this header. And then I want padding, so I'm going to do P-4. That's padding all around. And then margin bottom 10. Okay, and then in the header, I want a container, because I don't want it, you know, I don't want this to be all the way over here, you know, when we make the screen really big or the browser really big. So let's add a class of max width, max W. We'll do 5XL, and then let's do margin auto to put it in the middle. And then for the text, we're going to have a class of text-XL, extra large. We want to bold the text, so we'll say font bold. And then I also want the text to be white, so text white. And then the text itself, we'll just say QR code generator. All right, so let's save that. And there we go. Now we have our header. So next we want, under the header, I'm going to add a main tag, and then we want our flex box. So when we create responsive layouts with Tailwind, it's mobile first. And we can use classes like, if I say MD and then I want to use the class of flex row like that, what will happen is this class will only apply when the screen or the browser is the medium, whatever that medium size is, and then up. Okay, so medium screens and up would get this class. So keep that in mind, because we want to do this, we want to make this responsive. So what I'm going to do is add a class of flex, which turns it to a flex box. I'm going to say flex-call-reverse, because by default, or I should say on small screens, I want it to be a column. I also want it to be reversed because I want the image to be on top, right? So if we look at that, the image is on top. Now, if I don't do reverse, if I just do flex call, then the image is going to be on bottom when it's a column. Okay, so let's say flex call reverse, And let's come back over here. I want to align the items to the center, so we can use align center, justify content to center, so justify center, and then margin auto. And then on medium screens, so on medium screens or in up, I want to use max, let's say max dash width dash 4XL. And then also on medium screens and up, I want this to be a flex row and go horizontal. Okay, so that's our flex box. And then what we'll do is we'll have these two divs. Let's just say div 1 for now, and then another div, and we'll say div 2. And if we save that, you can see it's a column, but once I hit that medium screen, it turns into a row and they're side by side. So that's what I want. Now, as far as the width for both of these, if we look at medium screens and up, I want this to be 2/3 and this to be 1/3. So what we'll do is add, let's say class, and it's going to be widthful to begin with, meaning it takes up the entire thing. But then on medium screens, we want the width to be not 1/2. We want the width to be 2/3. This is the first div. I'm also going to add some margin on the right. So let's say margin right 24. And then for this div, let's say class, we want it to be widthful to begin with. So mobile first. And then medium screens, we want it to be width dash 1/3. Okay, I think that's all I want here. Oh, I also want to add the class of self center, which we'll do align self and set that to center. Okay, so yeah, there we go. And again, you go down under medium screens and they're going to stack. So now the second div is going to be an image, so we might as well just add that real quick. So I'll say image, the source is going to be image/QRcode. And then let's add a couple classes here. So basically the image, I want it to take up half. Let's just see what it looks like if I save. So, I mean, that looks okay, but obviously I want this to be a little smaller. So what we'll do is we'll set the width to 1/2. Okay, so that's to begin with. And then let's move it to the middle. So we'll say margin auto. And then on medium screens and up, we can then set it back to full. So width full. And let's also add some margin bottom. I'm going to put that right here. So MB10. Yeah. All right, good. So if I make this bigger, yeah, I think that's good. That takes care of the image. Now for the text in the form, that's going to go in this first div, first flex item here. So the first thing we want is the heading. So let's do an H1 and let's say text-3XL, and let's do font-bold and margin, we'll do margin bottom 5. And then on medium screens, we'll make the text a little bigger. So let's say text dash, we'll do 4XL. Okay, and then that's going to just say QR code generator. So we'll save that. Okay, so underneath the heading, we're going to have a couple paragraphs. So let's go under that. And this paragraph, I'm just going to give it a class of MB4 to push the other one down. And then I'll just copy the text and paste that in. You guys can just type that out. And then there'll be another paragraph under it. And I'm just going to grab that text real quick. Okay, we'll save that. Good. Now I do want to have some padding. Why don't I have any padding on this? Let's see. Yeah. So on this div right here, the flex div, let's add, let's say P-10. There we go. Okay, so back down here, we want to go under this last paragraph, and now we're going to add the form. So let's say form, I'm going to give it an ID of generate. We'll say generate-form. And then as far as classes go, I'm just going to do a margin top 4. And we don't need an action attribute. We can get rid of that. Okay, so now inside the form here, we're going to have a text input for the URL. We'll use the URL type, but then we have a bunch of classes. So we're going to do width full. Let's say border -2, and the border color, we'll do border -gray 200. Let's make it rounded, and padding 3. And then for the text, we'll do text gray dark, and let's say margin right 2. And then in the focus state, I want to remove the outline, so I'm going to say focus : outline none. And then let's say margin bottom 5. Okay, so that's the classes. Whoops, let's save that. All right, and then I'm just going to add on to that an ID, because we need to access this from the JavaScript. So for the ID, let's say URL, and then I'm also going to change the type to URL as well. And then we'll add a placeholder as well. So let's say placeholder, we'll say enter a URL. All right, so there's our URL input. Next, we want the select with the size. So still within the form tag, let's say select, and I'm going to add some classes. Actually, we can probably just copy. Yeah, we'll just copy all these classes. And we don't need a name. The ID is going to be size. Let's say class equals, and then we'll paste in all those classes, except for the MB5. We don't need that. All right, now within the select, we want to have our options. So let's say option, the value for this is going to be 100, and then for the text, we'll say 100 by 100. And then we'll copy this down a bunch. So we want 200, 2, and then 3. Actually, I'm just going to paste this in. Okay, so we just have 100 to 700. If you want to change these up, you can. And I'm going to select 300 by default. Then we just need the button. So underneath the select, let's say button, and let's do a BG-gray 600. Let's do rounded, and the width we'll do full. Text color will be white, and let's do padding on the y-axis 3. And padding on the x-axis 4, margin top 5, and then on the hover state, I'm going to change the BG to black. Okay, and then let's just add in here a type of submit, and then we'll say generate QR code. All right, cool. So yeah, that should really do it as far as the top section. Yep, so that looks good. Now down below it is where the QR code is going to generate. So we want to keep that within the main tag, but we want to go underneath that flex div that we created. So I'll just say like this is where the generated QR code will go. Okay, so this div is going to have a container. So let's do max width 5XL. And margin, I want to do margin auto. Let's make it a flex box, but we're going to make it a flex column. And then we want a text, center, align, center, justify, center, and margin top 20. Now, there's going to be two things that go in here. There's going to be our spinner, and there's going to be we'll say QR code output. Okay, now the QR code output is simple. It's just going to be an ID of QR code. I'm also going to give it a class of mAuto to center it. And then that's basically the placeholder for the generated code. Now the spinner is going to be an SVG, and it's quite a bit. So if you go to the repo link in the description, you can just copy the spinner div that has the SVG in it. So I'll just paste that in. Let's just space this out a bit here. So yeah, I'll paste that in, and basically we just have, oops, I don't want two of these. we basically just have a div with the ID of spinner, and then inside that is the SVG. And if you want to change like the color and stuff like that, you can change up these attributes if you want. And then we also have just a span with the class of SR only that says loading, and that's it. So let's save that. We should see the spinner. Now we are gonna, in our JavaScript, we can set this to hide the spinner, but you might get a little flicker. So what I'm gonna do is just add in some style tags up here. Let's go right above the title, just to hide that spinner by default. So we'll just grab it by the ID and say spinner, and then display none. All right, so that way it doesn't show. It doesn't even show, it doesn't flicker or anything. All right, so now we're ready for the JavaScript. So let's jump into our script.js. And first thing I'm gonna do is just bring in a couple things. We wanna bring in the form. So I'll just say document.getElement by ID. And I believe it's generate-form is the ID. And then we're also gonna bring in the QR code div, which is where we wanna embed it. So QR code, and then let's just variable here, I'll call it QR. All right, now on the form, we want to add an event listener. So we want to listen for a submit. And when that happens, we'll say, let's say on generate submit for the function. And then we'll go ahead and create that up here. I'm going to use arrow functions, but if you want to use regular functions, that's absolutely fine. Okay, we want to prevent the default behavior because it's a form submission. And then let's get the form inputs. So the URL, we'll say document.getElement by ID, and that's going to be the ID of URL. Since it's an input, we need to get the value of it, not just the element. All right, and then we'll copy that down, and we want to get the size, which is the select box. That has an ID of size as well. And then let's just do a console log. Oops. For some reason that isn't working. Let's say console log of URL and size. All right, so let's save that. And if I come down here, and since I'm using the Tailwind CDN, it does give us this warning, but you can just ignore that. So I'm going to put a URL in here with the size, and you can see that it's logging that. Good. So next thing, I do want, well, let's just do a little bit of validation here. We're going to say if URL is equal to an empty string, then I'm just going to show an alert. I might add us a custom alert box later on, but for now we'll just do this. We'll say please enter a URL. Okay, and then else if they do enter a URL, I do want to show the spinner. So what I'm going to do is right under the onGenerate form or onGenerate submit, let's say const show spinner. Okay, and all we want to do here is select the spinner. So we'll say document get element by ID spinner, and we want to set the style of display to block. Okay, so that's going to show it, and then what we'll do is copy this down, and let's change the name of this to hide spinner, and all we're going to do is change that to none. Okay, and I know we put the CSS in, but I'm just going to call hide spinner to begin with. All right, and then down here, up here in the else, this is where we want to show the spinner. All right, so if I save that and we come over here and I click, well, first of all, let's check the validation. That shouldn't let me submit. If I do put something in and click, now we have the spinner showing. Okay, now, and again, the spinner is completely optional. I think it's just a nice UI effect, but I'm going to show it for 1 second. So I want to add a set timeout here. So set timeout takes in a function. So I'm going to add an arrow function. And the second argument that's passed in to set timeout is the number of milliseconds you want to wait. I'm going to say 1000, which is 1 second. Okay, and then I want to hide the spinner. So let's save that. And if we try to submit this again, whoops, you'll see it shows the spinner for 1 second. All right, so now what we want to do is generate the QR code, and that's where this library comes in. So QRcode.js. And all we have to do is create this object using new QR code, takes in wherever you want to put it, so the element, and then it takes in an object with this information here, the text, which is the URL you want to open, the width and height. You can also do color dark, color light, but we're not going to do that in this particular project. If you want to add like a color input and do that, you could. So let's create a separate function for this. We'll call it generate QR code, and that's going to actually take in a URL and a size. And then we want to create a variable. We'll say QR code and set that to new QR code. That's how it is, right? Let's see. Yep. All right. And then we're going to pass in the ID that we want to use, which is QR code, and then an object with a text value, and that's going to be the URL. That's going to come from the form, but it's going to be passed into this function as an argument. And then we can do a width, which is going to be the size, right? And then the height, which is also going to be the size. Okay, and that's all we need here. So let's save that. And then let's see, we want to run this function right after we show the spinner. Yeah, so I'm sorry, right after we hide the spinner. So we hide the spinner, and then we call generate QR code, and we want to pass in the URL and size, which comes from here, comes from the form. So let's try it out. We'll save it, and let's go ahead and put in a URL. Okay, the spinner shows for a second, and then it generates the code. If we want to do like 100. Okay, so we have an issue right now, which is it's showing, it's going to just keep that there. So we need to clear the UI or clear the code, you know, before we do anything. So let's create a function. We'll just go right here. Let's say const, and I'm going to call this clear UI, because we're also going to have a save button that we need to clear as well. But for now, let's just set QR, which we brought in up here. So QR code, we're going to set, let's say .inner HTML, and set it to nothing. And then where I'm going to call this is in the right here on generate submit. I want to do this before anything. So clear UI. Let's try it again. Okay, so we get the code. Now if I want to do another one, let's say 100, clears the UI first and then generates the QR code. Okay, so we have that working. Now the last thing we want to do is the button. So the button I didn't add to the HTML because we're going to create it from the JavaScript using create element. It's actually a link, not a button. But let's go down here, and we're going to create a new function here. Let's call it create save btn, and we're going to pass in save URL. Okay, now let me just finish this first. All right, so I'm just going to show you real quick. If I generate a code and we open up our dev tools and I go to elements, I just want to show you, if we examine this, we have the canvas element, and then we have the image element here, which has a source of this data image/png, and it's a lot, but that's the URL that we want to get. Okay, so when we're going to get the URL up above, but we're going to pass it into this function, and basically we want to make that the href value of this link that we're creating. And that will allow us to click the button and download it as an image. Now we could right click and say save image as. If I mean, you could just have a message that says that, right click, save image as, but I think it's a little more convenient to just have a button to click to download. All right, so the URL is going to get passed into this. Now we want to create the link, so I'm going to create a variable here called link, and we're going to set that to document dot and then create element, and the element we want to create is an a tag, a link. Okay, then I'm going to add onto that link an ID. We'll just give it an ID of save-link. Okay, I want to add onto that some classes because I want it to be styled. So let's say class list, and then we can just add in a bunch of classes here. So I'll say bg-red-500, so same as the header. On hover, let's do bg-red-700, and we'll do text-white font-bold, and padding on the y-axis 2. We'll make it rounded, and we'll do a width of, let's say, 1/3, rounded. So width of 1/3, and then margin auto, and my-5. All right, so those are the classes that I want to add. And then, like I said, the href is going to be the save URL. So yeah, I'm going to do save URL, and then link dot download. We're going to set that to QR code, and then the inner HTML. So link dot inner HTML. We'll do save image. All right, and then finally we want to put it into the DOM. So document dot get element by D. I'm going to put it within the. Actually, did I add a class of generated? I didn't. So this div that wraps around the spinner and the QR code output, I'm going to add. Let's do an ID. Actually, we'll say ID generated. Okay, so that way we can come down here, say get element by ID generated, and then we want to append child, and we want to append that link. All right, so right now nothing's going to happen because we've just created the function to create the button. Where we want to actually call this function is up here. All right, now just to kind of quickly go over this, when we submit the form, we get the URL and the size, check for the URL. If it's there, we show the spinner. We hide the spinner after 1 second. We call generate QR code, which then puts the QR code on the screen. Now after that, we want to output the button, but there's a little trick to this, because the URL to the image that we need to pass into the create save to this right here, create save button, it's not going to be available to us right away. So what we can do to get around that is just do another set timeout, and that's going to take in a function, and then the second argument is the number of milliseconds that we want to take, and we'll just say 50. So it'll be really quick, and then that image should be available to us. So what we'll do is create a variable, let's call it save URL, and we want to, from the QR element, which is the QR code ID element where the code is actually output, we want to run query selector on that because we want the image that's inside of it, and we want the address to that image or the source. Okay, then we can finally create the save button, and then we can pass in the save URL. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. Now we are going to have one more issue. I'll show you that in a second, but let's go ahead and just click a URL, choose a size, generate, Now we can see the button, and if we click it, it downloads the image. Okay, now if I want to do something else, like let's say Google, say 400, and I generate. So it generates and we get the button, but the old button is still there. So we have to clear that out. That's something that when you're using vanilla JavaScript, you really have to be aware of, you know, what's on the screen, because you have to manually take care of that and remove it. Where when you're using frameworks, the framework does a lot of that for you, or gives you a lot of helpers for you to do that stuff. But all we have to do is go into clear UI, right? We already have the function that runs and it clears out the QR code itself. Now we just want to do the button. So let's say const save btn, and we want to get it with document.get element by ID. And remember, we gave it an ID right here of save link. Maybe we should call this save link, save button, whatever. But we want to get it save dash link, and then we'll just check for it. So we'll say if save link, then let's go ahead and we'll say save link, and then we'll call the remove method. We'll just remove it from the DOM completely. All right, so now let's try it again. Get our QR code, we get the image. If I do another one, let's do 600, generate. Okay, so now we only have one button. If I click that, that should work. All right, because it clears the UI. It gets rid of the old QR code and it gets rid of the button right here, and then it proceeds to do everything else. All right, guys, so that's it. And obviously to test this out, just scan it with your phone. So if you open up the camera app and scan it, you should be able to open it in a browser. And if you print this out on paper or you download it as an image, you should be able to do the same thing. All right, so I mean, it's a very simple project, but I think it is useful. And I want you to just keep in mind what I said at the beginning of this tutorial about creating your own side projects, because I think it can be beneficial for many different reasons. All right, so hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.